We've already seen the idea of templates, of actually having our HTML sitting on the server in a file, and then we can perhaps replace the contents, use placeholders, etc., in order to judge and determine what the final string of HTML that's actually sent in the HTTP response should be. Now, Express comes with the ability to plug in a whole variety of template engines. So let's look at templates and template engines. Express as a framework is what's called, and it likes to tout this, very unopinionated. That means it likes you to have choice. It doesn't want to plug you into one way of doing things. So when it comes to view engines, that can be very much an opinion on each developer's part as what they like to use to build their templates. So Express simply gave the ability to plug in to build your own template engines that would then output on the response stream back down to the HTTP response. So under Guide, you can actually look at using template engines. And it's actually very simple. You install a template engine in NPM, download it from the NPM registry, and if it's built properly, it will automatically plug in to Express itself. You just have to set the view engine, and there's a statement to do that. You set the view engine using app.set, and literally the phrase view space engine, and then the next is the actual file extension of the type of file that you're going to use so we can find it. Then you build your templates. This, for example, is a very popular template engine called Jade. If you look at it, it doesn't look like HTML at all, but those indentations are translated into HTML along with the code. Jade is a little strange to me to use sometimes when you're dealing with designers, but you may really like it. That's why Express is unopinionated. So I'm going to go ahead and use a very simple engine that's been around a long time called EJS. And remember, a template engine is just a utility that will take text and translate it ultimately into the HTML that should be delivered in the HTTP response. So EJS, which can be found at ejs.co and also on GitHub and also on NPM, is very simple. It has some good features and it's missing some features, but it may not be the one I would use all the time, but I have used it. I like it. It's inspired by ASP.NET Web Forms, which is a Microsoft technology, and the templates those use. And so it's probably familiar to some of you, at least on appearance. But ultimately, it's a great, simple one for our purposes for this course. It uses these delimiters, a less than % and a % greater than, and an equals when you want to output. And between these, you can put JavaScript code. And if you're using the equals, this will be outputted, turned into a string. And so this block right here, for example, would output this H2 if you had a user object. And if you did, it would output the user.name. It's a very classic example of the use of a template. So I can actually run JavaScript code inside of it and output data. And Express gives me the means then to connect the URL of the file to the route and as well as the data that the template might need to use in the code that's actually inside the template. All right, let's take a look. So the first thing I'll do is npm install EJS and save it to my package.json as a dependency because my app will be dependent on EJS being there in order to run. And of course, EJS is just JavaScript code, just like Express is. So that installed, and now it's in my node_modules. And EJS is built so that will automatically integrate with Express. Then I can specify with app.set view space engine, and the file extension I'll use for my files will just be EJS, so that it knows where to find those files. Now by default, and you can change this with app.set, but by default, the Express framework will look for the files, the static files, what they call the views, inside a folder called views. And views really just means your user interface, your UI. So I'll make a new file inside the views folder called index.ejs, because that's what I said I would use as the file extension. And then I could write some HTML in here. Now, one problem I have is in Visual Studio Code, and you might have this problem in your text editor, I'm not getting the nice syntax coloring and help. Now in Visual Studio Code, in the bottom right corner, it says plain text. I can set the language mode and say what language I'm writing in. And once I tell it HTML, then it gives me my help for HTML. And if you're using Visual Studio Code, you can do that. And if you aren't, you probably have something similar in your text editor or IDE. So I'll just say hello world. That's my index. And I'll also put my style sheet link. So I'll say href equals, and remember we said assets, and we'll just properly set up a style sheet link tag, and that's it. Now back in my app.js, all I have to do is, instead of sending the HTML manually, I can say res.render. And what Express will do, it will say, all right, I will go to wherever you've said the views are, and by default it's in the views folder, and then I will look for a file of the name you give me, and I'll call it index, plus the file extension that you set up for the view engine. So index.ejs. This is nice that we don't have the file extension here, because if I ever switched view engines, I wouldn't have to go find all the code that figures out what file to render. I would just have to change the extension that I'm looking for. So this will render the index. It will go out, get the contents of the file, process it, and render it. Now I haven't put anything dynamic in there, so I should just get it. So I'll go ahead and run my app, and then refresh localhost 3000, and there we are. Notice that it's not in H1 like it was before, and it just rendered the HTML. So now I can just change this on the fly here, and every time it will grab it. Now some of the template engines will actually cache the contents and then update the cache when you change the file, which makes it faster. So that worked. That's pretty simple. And now a designer could come in, or I could come in and much more easily change and edit my contents. Let's make another one. Let's call this person.ejs. And we'll do basically the same thing, but now we'll replace it, and I need to set what content it is, just so I get my nice coloring here in Visual Studio Code. Then I'll say person. Now remember, if we wanted to output something, a placeholder, or run some code, with EJS in particular, we need to use these special characters. And in this case, I'm just going to output, just like we did before, whatever's passed in. I'll call this ID, or let's do it in all capitals just to differentiate. So this will be data given to the view that it can run and parse and figure out and then generate the proper HTML. Now, how is it going to get this data? It's very simple. This render method, which EJS is already automatically hooked into when we have it running alongside Express, we can actually give it a JavaScript object for when it renders one of these views. And that object will be available whenever we do anything. It will essentially be the variable when we're referencing properties and methods and content on it. So if I say ID, and then now get my req.params.id like we did before, this ID can be used as a regular variable inside here. And most of the view engines work this way. We give it data. Render works that way anyway. and then they'll use this object, and you don't even have to reference that object. You're just automatically getting any properties on that object. And I can also run JavaScript beyond that. So let's give this a try. First, we're going to need to render this properly. So instead of index, which doesn't need that, we'll just say res.render person and give it data. Now my index didn't use any data, so that's fine. But my person.ejs, remember this is the file name, and the view engine setting set the file extension name. So it will look for person.ejs in views, and then give this to EJS in order to figure out what to do when it sees these special characters, and ultimately generate the string that gets streamed to the response. And I still have hello world, and then I can go to /person/1, and there it is. It outputted correctly. You see that? It took this HTML and EJS got that object and then did its thing. It saw the placeholder, replaced it with the value of that property on the object that we gave the view, and generated the proper HTML. Now you might notice that the style sheet is wrong. It doesn't have the proper font. You know, that's one of those mistakes you can make when you're dealing with dynamically generated things, especially dynamically generated URLs. Even though we know there is no /person folder, to the browser, that's what we're asking for. And so when it asks for asset/style, now that we're under /person, it's keeping that as part of the URL. So I really need to make sure that it's understanding that we're asking particularly for it at the root. So I just put a slash in front, and then that took care of it. But it's those kind of things you have to think about and you can miss when you aren't really thinking about folders, but you have to remember that the browser doesn't understand what's happening behind the scenes in your Node app. It only knows what it has from an HTTP request and response perspective. Now that said, we now have a lot of flexibility. We can do things, and if you use things like PHP or ASP.NET, this will seem familiar to you, but I essentially have code sitting inside my HTML. So I could, for example, this is really treated as a string, so I could say .length instead of the actual value. And then if I give it Tony, I get a length of 4. And if I remove .length and just show the value, then I get Tony. So I have complete flexibility. I can put for loops, I can give it arrays of data in that object that I give it. The object is generally called the model. The object that I give the view, and I could have arrays on it, and I could loop over those arrays with for loops or for each, and generate multiple columns or rows of data or whatever it is I want to do. I can generate the HTML, I can generate the UI. That's the point of a template engine. And if I like EJS, if I like the structure and the syntax, then I can use it. Now EJS actually has something called include, so I can easily have the same header and footer on every page. But others are a bit more powerful and have something called layouts, where I actually define a single entire parent page and then embed the contents of my other pages inside of it. And that gets combined, and it's actually a bit better when it comes to perhaps restyling or redesigning your site later. It's also a matter of taste when it comes to syntax. If you're coming from ASP.NET Web Forms, you might love EJS because it looks just the same. Or if you're coming from ASP.NET MVC, there's a view engine called Vash, V-A-S-H, that looks just like the Razor syntax that Microsoft made. If you're coming from perhaps something on the browser side and you're used to Backbone, there's something called Handlebars. If you're used to dealing just with the HTML yourself and you don't have to deal much with designers, you could try Jade. A lot of people like Jade because I don't have to type all of the less than and greater than signs with my HTML, but the HTML is ultimately generated by the engine. So as you can see, there's a lot of choice. And I can't tell you what's the best one because that's really up to you. So you should try a few different view engines. All you have to do is install them via NPM and then set whatever the file extension you're going to use for them is, and then simply set your page, put it inside views, call render, give it a model, an object if you need, and then try it out. Try out if statements and loops and fors and replacing values and whatever else is interesting. But this took care of the idea of dynamically generating HTML on the fly. And so this makes Express, combined with the idea of view engines, something that you'll see a lot of and that in your apps you'll most likely want to use.